The Muckrakers are restless. This is today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, and I'm delighted to be joined, the hamster wheels worked, by Dan Wootton, the host of the brilliant Outspoken. How are you, Dan?
Good morning. I am so sorry. We've been having some technical difficulties this morning, so I can't see you, but hopefully you can hear me okay.
We can hear you absolutely brilliant. And I had the joy of being on Dan's show last week on the brilliant Outspoken. If you haven't subscribed, go and do that straight after this programme. And Dan, we've been looking at the misery caused by Starmageddon. We've looked at two-tier Kia. We've looked at the problems about the winter fuel allowance being adopted. And we're just coming on to the threat, if you like, to free speech and the media's role in all of this. Now, you yourself have been the victim of media manipulation and misrepresentation. What's your take on the current state of play?
I think it's terrifying. I think it is truly terrifying where we are at. I mean, we have seen the arrest in France of the chief executive of Telegram. We have seen the chief executive of Rumble literally flee the country because he's in fear of being arrested. We have seen folk in the UK arrested, citizen journalists, simply for posting information with the caveat, if this is true. So I believe that there is an attack on independent journalism going on, and certainly the desire is to shut down voices like mine. And you saw the lengths they went to last year, if you're in the UK, to do that. And obviously, in my case, GB News, the channel that I worked for, which I believe was a freedom of speech channel and was a channel that was all about pushing narratives and not giving in to the establishment. Well, unfortunately, when it came to me, they did give in to the establishment on completely spurious grounds. So I think there are huge threats in lots of different places. So I think it's amazing what you're doing on TNT, and hopefully my show, Outspoken, will provide that alternative voice for the UK. But it's tough because, of course, you have to operate on big tech. Lots of people will be watching this right now on YouTube. That is big tech.
No, you're absolutely right. And the biggest concern, I mean, it always used to be, if you don't read the newspapers, you're ill-informed, and if you read the newspapers, you're misinformed. The reality is now we're drowning in a sea of misinformation. And what I love about the Muckrakers and TNT in particular, and your brilliant show, Outspoken, is that you give people a platform to correct that misrepresentation. What are the lies that have been peddled about you in the media?
Oh, goodness, I don't even know where to start, to be honest. I mean, literally, last year, my show on GB News had ended up being the #1 show. We were absolutely on fire. And at that point, a malicious attack began by an organisation that I even refuse to name because I don't want to give them any publicity, but they are fake news merchants. They are on the hard left, and they collaborated with an ex-boyfriend of mine to literally try and destroy my life with lies. And they were complete and utter lies. But what happens is that now, if you are falsely accused of something, very often the mainstream media will just run a country mile. They just want away from you because they do not want to take the risk of woke advertising agencies freaking out. So in my case, that's what happened, but fundamentally it was designed to try and get me off air at GB News. I know that, and in the end, a very spurious reason was used, which was when Lawrence Fox came on my show, the actor turned political activist, said that he didn't want to shag a particular woman, and all hell broke loose, and you would think that he had just gone and murdered 3 people on the street. So it is a completely disproportionate response. But we've seen this happen with lots of people. Look at Russell Brand, for example. No one gave a damn about his womanizing behavior when he was on the left and he was supporting Ed Miliband in the Labour Party in the UK and was considered a socialist. As soon as he became someone in the independent media who was challenging narratives, questioning the efficacy of the vaccine, questioning what was really going on in Ukraine, all of a sudden, all of these claims about his personal life were used to cancel him 10, 15 years on. So that's what happened with me. But the reality is that you cannot trust now what you read in the mainstream media. And I say that as someone who worked in the mainstream media for years and years and years, but they have changed. They do now only propagate one particular narrative. And I've been calling it out for years now, but look at the examples this weekend. I mean, here in London, where I'm based, you have this Notting Hill Carnival event where 3 people have been stabbed, a young woman is in hospital, there have been 50 arrests, assaults on police officers, and you have Sly News, as I call them, and I know Australians will probably like Sky News Australia, but Sly News over here is owned by Comcast, and it's a completely different kettle of fish. And they described the event as mostly peaceful.
Yeah, it is shocking, Dan. We were talking about that beforehand, the poor woman who's in hospital fighting for her life and the other 2 stab victims. And George Orwell, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And my concern... Dan makes a very
interesting point about the disproportionate response to Lawrence Fox's remarks on his programme on GB News. There was a time when we could laugh at things like that, brush it off. So what? I mean, it really is utterly inconsequential what Lawrence Fox says about who he does or doesn't want to shag. But these days, this is amplified out of all proportion. We get all this fake outrage and people must be cancelled as a result. Now, I don't know the details of the Jermaine Genus case, but he's apparently guilty of sending inappropriate messages to women. Okay. So what, at the end of the day? The BBC have gone as far as to remove him from their archives. They're going back over all the previous episodes of Match of the Day in which he appeared and editing him out as if he'd murdered 50 children. You know, it's absolutely unbelievable stuff, Dan.
Yeah, and I guess you've got to look at this in the prism of Jimmy Savile, who was the DJ as well, the Radio 1 DJ. There's recent examples as well, isn't there, of BBC staff doing pretty horrendous things. So when you view it in the context of that, it's horrendous.
Well, the problem is this, and I know it's difficult, Dan. You've also got Basil Valentine and James Freeman as well. I know you can't see them. That's why they're talking over each other. But my point on that particular case is that the BBC, I think, overreacted to start with when it was just a claim. And my point is I hate trial in the media because it's unfair on everybody. And Jermaine's name and image was splattered all over the papers whilst it was only a claim. And I think that the BBC responded in a way basically to the inaction and the criticisms they had about the inaction to do with Hugh Edwards, Jimmy Savile and so on and so forth. And I think they went to the other extreme. What's your take on that, Dan?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's true. The BBC is a haven for paedophiles. It has covered up for paedophiles for decades. There was just a new breaking story last week about the paedophile network that was active at the BBC throughout the 70s, the 80s, and the 1990s. Of course, their most recent paedophile, or at least accessor of child pornography, is Hugh Edwards, a man who presented their flagship bulletin for 20 years and announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Yet Jermaine Genus, a young mixed-race guy who sent a few saucy messages behind his wife's back. No one's saying that's a good thing, including Jermaine Genus, but he's treated as if he's the paedophile and is immediately cancelled by the BBC with no due process, no chance to explain himself. And the problem is now with these sort of quote-unquote misconduct allegations, no one will touch this guy now. His agent stumped him. TNT Sports, not connected to you guys, has run away from him. TalkSport has run away from him. And this is the world of cancel culture that we live in. It is woke tyranny. And there's a real sort of moral purity test about this that goes on as well. But the bizarre thing is that then the same people will speak up for absolute depravity when it comes to, for example, teaching young children about extreme sex. So I think the woke have absolutely no consistency when it comes to these sorts of issues. But trust me, cancel culture is very usually connected to someone's political positions these days.
And talking about political positions, Dan, I mean, we're shining a spotlight on Starmer, and in a way, he's making it even worse. There was a thought crime. Somebody was arrested. A Christian volunteer has just received a payout of £13,000 and an apology from the police when she was praying outside of an abortion clinic, and basically she was silent in prayer. And basically, if we start criminalising thought, that route is going to be even worse, isn't it, Dan?
I think it's absolutely chilling. I mean, good on this woman. I followed her case for a long time. It was completely despicable what happened to her. But you just know that there is no way any police force in the UK would arrest a Muslim woman or man who was praying in the street. But of course, a Christian woman, completely different kettle of fish. And we have seen the same thing happen, Andrew, with the so-called riots. And I call them so-called riots because actually there has been vast inconsistency when it comes to the policing of the people who have been arrested, sent to jail, sometimes for sending a tweet or making an inappropriate Facebook post, like Julie Sweeney, the 53-year-old carer for her husband, who posted a message to a Facebook group in the heat of the moment when she was absolutely horrified by the Southport massacre, and has ended up in prison for 15 months. This is a woman who has never been in trouble with the law, is a grandmother to 3 lovely children. She gets locked up, and yet there are child rapists, violent criminals who are currently avoiding prison in the UK. So we know what this is. It is an attack on the largely white, but actually I don't even think it's about ethnicity. It's about an attack on the working classes. The new government, Slippery Starmer as I call him, to take care, is absolutely desperate to shut up criticism, and he is using the full force of the law to do so. Now, I would say that would be fine if there was a consistent approach, but do we see any sort of media witch hunt for the folk who have just gone around stabbing people at the Notting Hill Carnival? Or what about the Muslim man who attacked a waitress in Nando's in London? The Metropolitan Police did absolutely nothing and told the victim that he was just having a bad day. It's unbelievable, the level of truth.
It's shocking, and we spoke about that at the beginning of the thing, the Nando's, and the sad thing is the video's only just emerged. It was in March. They talk about the speed with which other justice is done, and I always make the point, justice should not just be done, but be seen to be done, and justice is supposed to be blind. Doesn't matter what colour, creed, or religion, so on and so forth. The other point I would make very, very quickly before the end of today's show is they're now starting to look at WhatsApp messages, and people used to think that WhatsApp messages were encrypted private conversations, but ever since the Wayne Couzens case, and it's a primary school teacher as well, they're now looking at that. Very quickly, Dan, 10 seconds, what's your take on that?
I think it's really chilling. Kelly J. Keane has moved all of her conversations off WhatsApp. It feels like no sort of communication is safe, but we can't be afraid, is my message, Andrew, because if we stop speaking out, then what about ordinary folks? So we all have to be brave. They can't arrest us all for thought crimes, can they?
The prisons are not big enough. 1 in, 1 out. Dan, we'll keep doing that. That's Dan Wootton, the brilliant host of the wonderful Outspoken. Do and have a look at that. Sign up today. Basil and James, a real pleasure. Dan, we're going to get you back in glorious Technicolor next time. But for me, Andrew Eborn, I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.